So this is the studio in Rochester. It's in an old sort of disused brewery tower. So this is where everything's made. Because of the size, it enables me to mock quite a lot of the installations up. And if it's not big enough, then I tend to sort of spill out into other parts of the tower here, which is a sort of a luxury that won't last forever, I'm sure. I wouldn't say I'm a studio-based artist. I don't come in here unless I have to. I come in here when there's things that need to be made. So these are the rejects from the sort of leftovers from the Oak Effect show. And so for one reason or another, whether it's the proportions or the format, or perhaps they don't have the geometry or the that sort of angularity, they have perhaps these slightly twee details that I felt weren't suitable for the show. Oak Effect installation is quite typical of my sort of activities. It's what I prefer to refer to as an environment, perhaps, than an installation, and it's similar to one or two others that I've produced before, where it takes on the footprint of a domestic dwelling. So the whole installation comprises this two-bedroom flat, which is made entirely of plastic oak. Everything from the floor, the laminate floor, up to the kitchen cupboards, the kitchen table, the bathroom, the pedestal sink. Everything is in this plastic oak effect, and then that becomes this huge elaborate pedestal for the 100 or so artefacts from the Tyne archives and museum. It's actually a two-bedroom apartment from the athletes' village, the Olympic village in Stratford. It's pretty much almost in breach of EU space standards. It's about 12 metres by 4. And in my mind, it's a starter home. It's for a sort of family perhaps not dissimilar to my own, where there's a mum, a dad and a kid. And what I quite like about this particular design, it's one of the real ones that exist there, it's the sort of the symmetry which makes it particularly bland and impersonal, I think. I suppose what's different about this one is that in the past I've built the entire thing with walls and all the fixtures and fittings, and this one is like a sort of ghost architecture, so it just has the footprint demarcated in the floor, and then it has the lights suggesting the height of the ceiling, but everything else is left to the imagination. The moments within the exhibition that I sort of enjoy, I suppose there's a little bit of sort of cheek there, a bit of satire, and perhaps it's things like the 19th century tricycle in the hallway as you arrive, which is not unlike most of my mates' flats that I visit, where you have the fixed speed in the hall and you walk in and so you've got this sort of lever, sort of powered tricycle completely blocking the way. So if we were allowed in this flat, we probably couldn't get past it. Or the moment where the sort of Madonna, the fertility figure, is sat watching the big fatback sort of 70s television, or finding the electric shock therapy in the bathroom where one might expect to find the jar of Prozac. And I think these are all sort of things that, working with the curator and the registrar at Tyne, they're things that they perhaps wouldn't have felt they would have got away with otherwise if they didn't have this sort of opportunity to work with an artist that can come in and have license to do that, because most of these objects sort of come with a sort of prerequisite as to how they should be shown and in what context and what message should be conveyed. One of the appeals for me of working with the museum services collection is obviously all the objects are imbued with this sort of much richer history than perhaps we'd encounter in our day-to-day lives and the objects on the high street. But I also have to sort of say that it's sort of no more important or interesting to me to work with this, rich sort of museums collection as it is to work with the Argos catalogue. For me, they're just parameters, and they're just things that are given to me to then sort of manage and organise as a sort of someone that works with and arranges objects. Basically, the invitation initially was to come to the Shipley and to all the other museums within the Museums Trust and and make an exhibition. It was quite a loose sort of invitation, and so I went up a few times and looked through, and it's obviously sort of incredible and fascinating and almost too much, like a kid in a candy store. What do you do with all that stuff? I decided to reduce it just to wooden artefacts, which would mean that when I was looking through the social history, the archaeology, the ethnography, every department that we're sort of able to access, it sort of made it a bit more manageable. Everything, these sort of categories emerged, and then within those categories I was trying to then represent the sort of 7 continents. And so where you had gaps, it became actually more interesting. So when you realise that there's loads of guns from Europe but none from parts of Africa, that tells you something. And so all these sort of facts that emerged became quite interesting, quite sort of important to the work. And it was a way for me to try and take out the emotion on my part, because as the person coming in selecting, you're just obviously wowed by everything, and you're sort of emotionally drawn to the novelty, and you're seduced by certain things, but then that novelty wears off eventually. And as an artist, I don't think it's really right for me to just go around showing you what I find really interesting that will probably wear off in a couple of weeks for me and subsequently for you too. So I try and make the whole thing a bit more objective. So I set up these sort of, as I say, these sort of filters to sort of ensure against that. So the whole thing becomes almost a bit more mechanical in the way sort of Duchamp would talk about trying to be more sort of indifferent about these things, so you don't get too bogged down with the emotional aspect. And I think a lot of it is almost trying to go against some of those preconceptions that we think of the museum as the sort of arbiter of good taste, and we think that it's the authority, and we think that we should all sort of we should sort of subscribe to whatever we're told this is about. But actually I think it's exactly the way things are exoticized, the way they're sort of fetishized, that I'm quite wary of, and I would rather sort of try and sort of think again, re-question. I think some of these things are anything but good taste. You've got objects that probably shouldn't be in this country, and you've got a carving of a Native American that's based entirely on stereotype and carved by anyone but a Native American, and we've got sort of, like I say, I think some of these things need questioning. And so I suppose there is a degree of sort of institutional critique there, but it's not going for the jugular of museum services in Tyne and Ware. It's just a general sort of comment about the way we sort of amass objects in these cultural sort of institutions generally. And so for me, one of the incentives is, yes, to sort of activate these objects and help us sort of see them in relation to the things that surround us, make them more sort of relevant to our sort of contemporary lives. And so that's where some of these sort of juxtapositions come in. And so I suppose the obvious ones in this exhibition are things like sort of man versus machine, and nature versus artifice, and craft versus industry, and east-west, and the secular and the sacred, and all these different sort of opposites that we're playing with, that are all sort of relevant to our lives today, that we're sort of thinking about increasingly, sort of as the world is becoming more sort of homogenized and sort of standardized, and things are more increasingly sort of mass-produced. If the artifacts within this installation are about anthropology, and we're trying to bring that into a contemporary context here now today, then I think there's no better place to sort of present that than the home. I think I've talked about the sort of what the home is to us all. It's sort of everything. It's where we apparently hang out now. All the pubs are shutting down. It's where we do our shopping now. The high streets have all closed down. It's where we sit and wait for our Waitrose or Ocado delivery to sit and eat instead of going to the restaurant. We're becoming sort of increasingly insular, and I think that we're expecting more from the home. And so for me, it seemed like the perfect sort of pedestal upon which to place all these objects, and to create these sort of comparisons and juxtapositions and contrasts and tensions, and hopefully to sort of shed light on what's happening today, and for us to try and fathom what's going on here and now.